Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we follow a teenage Shoshone girl who had been kidnapped, sold, and survived the unimaginable, and then quietly guided an entire nation across a continent it had no right to claim. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let your body settle into whatever surface is holding you right now. Feel the weight of your limbs, the warmth of the blanket, the small sounds of the room around you slowly softening into quiet. Tonight, we travel a very long way. We are going west. Farther west than most people in 1803 could even imagine. Across rivers so wide they seemed like inland seas. Across plains where the grass moved in waves like something breathing. Through mountains that had no names yet in any language the Eastern world knew. And somewhere in the middle of all of that vastness, there is a young woman. She is carrying a baby on her back. She is perhaps 16 years old, perhaps 17. She has already lived through more loss and displacement than most people experience in a lifetime. And yet she is moving forward, quietly, steadily, reading the land the way a scholar reads a page. Her name is Sacagawea. And tonight, we are going to follow her, slowly and gently, through everything she saw, everything she carried, and everything she gave to a world that was still learning how to see her. Part 1: The World Before the Journey, the Shoshone People and the Land They Called Home. There is a specific quality of light in the high valleys of the Rocky Mountains in late summer. It comes low and golden through the gaps in the peaks, and it falls on the sagebrush and the bunch grass and the cold, fast rivers in a way that makes everything look both very near and very ancient. The light seems to slow time down. It makes even movement look like a kind of stillness. This was the world Sacagawea was born into. Sometime around the year 1788 or 1789, in what is now the state of Idaho, in the territory of the Agaidika band of the Lemhi Shoshone people. The Agaidika. The word means, roughly, salmon eaters, and it tells you almost everything important about where they lived and how they survived. They were a people shaped by rivers. By the cold, clear, boulder-strewn tributaries of the Salmon River system that ran down from the mountains and carried, twice a year, enormous runs of salmon from the Pacific all the way into the heart of the Rockies. To understand Sacagawea, you have to understand this landscape first. Because she was not simply a person who passed through it. She was a person formed by it. Her knowledge of plants and roots and the way water behaved in different seasons, her ability to navigate by the shape of ridgelines and the behavior of animals, her instinctive reading of weather and the color of the sky at dawn, all of this came from childhood years spent in these valleys, watching and learning in the way that Shoshone children learned, which was not in a classroom, but in the world itself. The Lemhi Shoshone were not a large nation by any measure of political power. They did not control a vast territory. They did not have permanent fortified villages. They were, by necessity and by tradition, a mobile people moving with the seasons, following the game, the fish runs, and the roots and berries that ripened at different elevations through the year. In summer, they moved to higher ground, to gather camas roots and hunt deer and antelope in the mountain meadows. In winter, they descended to the sheltered river valleys, where the temperatures were slightly less brutal and the game was more concentrated. And in the great salmon seasons, they gathered at the rivers with other bands and other peoples for the communal work of fishing and preserving food for the cold months ahead. There was a deep sociality to this life, one that is often overlooked. The image of the wandering, solitary native person moving through the wilderness is a romantic invention of later centuries. In reality, the Shoshone lived in a web of relationships, kinship ties, trading connections, seasonal alliances, ceremonies and gatherings that brought hundreds of people together across great distances. They knew who their neighbors were. They knew their neighbors' neighbors. They had a detailed, practical, and sophisticated understanding of the geography of an enormous region. Sacagawea's father, whose name is not preserved in any record we have, was likely a man of some standing within the Agaidika band. We know almost nothing specific about her mother, or whether she had siblings who survived to adulthood. The fragmentary records that exist, filtered mostly through the journals of the Lewis and Clark expedition written years later, give us only glimpses. But we can imagine, and this is not idle imagination, but historically grounded reconstruction, what childhood looked like for a girl in an Agaidika Shoshone band in the 1790s. She would have spent her earliest years close to the women of the group, learning by watching and doing. She would have learned which roots were safe to eat and which were toxic. She would have learned how to dig them efficiently with a pointed stick, how to dry and pound them into a flour that could be stored through winter. She would have learned to recognize plants not just by sight but by smell and texture, in all their stages of growth, in spring, in summer, in the dry heat of late August. She would have learned to read water, to know which rivers were crossable and where, which were treacherous beneath a calm surface, which carried fish and in what seasons. She would have learned the stars not as mythology but as navigation, and the mountains not as scenery but as landmarks that told you where you were and which direction you needed to travel to reach water, shelter, or safety. This knowledge, practical, embodied, environmental, was not considered extraordinary among her people. It was simply what every person needed to know to survive. But it was knowledge of extraordinary depth, built over generations, refined and passed down with great care. And it would, years later, prove to be among the most valuable contributions any single person made to one of the most ambitious exploratory expeditions in American history. But before the expedition, there was loss. And the loss came, as so much loss came to native peoples of the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains in the late 18th century, from the violence of neighboring peoples who had acquired something the Shoshone had not yet obtained, horses and guns. The Hidatsa people, a powerful agricultural nation living along the Missouri River in what is now North Dakota, had access to both. They were traders and warriors, and in the 1790s they conducted raids into the territories of their western neighbors, capturing horses, goods, and sometimes people. It was during one of these raids, sometime around the year 1800, when Sacagawea was approximately 11 or 12 years old, that the Agaidika band she lived with was attacked. The details of what happened during that attack are not fully known to us. What we know is that there was violence, that people were killed, and that several young Shoshone women and children, Sacagawea among them, were taken captive by the Hidatsa raiders. They were taken east. Away from the mountains, away from the rivers she knew, away from the people she loved, into a world entirely different from the one that had shaped her. She was a child who crossed an enormous distance not by choice, but by force. And she carried with her, in her memory and in her body, an intimate knowledge of the very lands that Lewis and Clark were, years later, trying desperately to understand. That knowledge would not be forgotten. Not by her. Part 2, Captivity and Transition, Life Among the Hidatsa and the Missouri River World. The Missouri River in autumn is a different thing entirely from the mountain streams of the Lemhi Valley. It is wide, and slow in places, and the color of dark clay after a rain. It smells of mud and distance. Along its banks in what is now central North Dakota, the cottonwood trees turn a pale, dusty gold, and the light goes flat and thin in October, and the wind comes off the plains with a cold that feels like a wall rather than a breeze. This was the world Sacagawea was brought to after her capture. The Hidatsa villages, known collectively as the Knife River Indian villages, were among the most remarkable settlements in all of North America at that time. They were not the temporary encampments of wandering peoples. They were substantial, permanent towns. The Hidatsa, along with their close neighbors and allies the Mandan people, built round earthen lodges, large, domed structures made from a framework of timber posts and beams covered with layers of willow branches, grass, and sod. These lodges were substantial buildings, some of them 60 feet across, housing multiple family groups, and inside, during the cold months, they were warm and smoky and crowded and alive with conversation, children, dogs, and the smell of drying corn and roasting meat. The villages were surrounded by extensive gardens. The Hidatsa and Mandan were accomplished farmers as well as hunters and traders, and their corn, beans, and squash made them wealthy in the currency that mattered most on the northern plains, food. They had surplus to trade, and they traded it across enormous distances, to the nomadic peoples of the plains, to other river peoples, and increasingly, to European and American traders coming up the Missouri from St. Louis. For a young Shoshone girl arriving as a captive, this world must have been at once alien and, in some ways, more secure than the mobile life she had known. There was food here. There was shelter that did not move. There was a community large enough to contain strangers. We do not know exactly how Sacagawea was treated during her early years among the Hidatsa. Captive women and children in many plains cultures were often integrated into family groups over time, adopted in various degrees, given work and a kind of conditional belonging. The process was rarely gentle at first. The grief of displacement, the loss of family, the strangeness of a new language and new customs, these were real and lasting wounds. But Sacagawea learned. She always learned. The Hidatsa language became familiar to her. The rhythms of the agricultural calendar, so different from the seasonal movements she had known, became part of her experience. And she continued to carry, in the back of her mind, the landscape of the mountains and the rivers she had come from, a mental map of a world most Hidatsa had never seen. Sometime between 1800 and 1804, when she was perhaps 13 to 15 years old, Sacagawea came into the possession of, there is no gentle way to put this, a French-Canadian fur trader named Toussaint Charbonneau. Charbonneau was a man of middling character and considerable experience in the fur trade. He had been living and working along the Missouri River for years, moving between the European trading world and the indigenous world with the pragmatic ease of a man whose primary interest was his own survival and comfort. He spoke French, some Hidatsa, and had acquired Sacagawea, along with at least one other young Shoshone woman, as what he called a wife, a relationship that was, by any honest accounting, more transaction than partnership. Charbonneau was perhaps twice her age. He was not a tender man, by most accounts. He was capable, sometimes cowardly, occasionally hot-tempered. He was not the kind of person anyone would cast as the companion to a young woman of quiet courage. And yet, this was her life now. The trading world of the Missouri River. The smell of beaver pelts and tallow candles and wood smoke in a lodge on the frozen edge of the river. The long, dark winters of the northern plains. The isolation of a world defined almost entirely by men's commerce. She was somewhere between 14 and 16 years old. She was far from home. She was pregnant. And in the autumn of 1804, a group of American soldiers and explorers arrived at the Mandan and Hidatsa villages and set up their winter camp just downstream. They were looking for a guide who knew the way to the Pacific. They found Toussaint Charbonneau. And through him, they found Sacagawea. The expedition of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark had been traveling up the Missouri River since May of that year, dispatched by President Thomas Jefferson with one of the most ambitious mandates ever given to an American military officer, to explore the newly acquired Louisiana Territory, find a navigable route to the Pacific Ocean, and document everything, the people, the plants, the animals, the land along the way. They were camped now at what they called Fort Mandan, a small collection of rough log buildings on the western bank of the Missouri, and they were making plans for the spring. Beyond the Mandan and Hidatsa villages, they were entering territory none of them had ever seen. They would need to cross the Rocky Mountains. And to cross the Rocky Mountains, they needed horses. And to get horses, they would need to trade with the Shoshone people who lived on the other side. For that, they needed someone who spoke Shoshone. Sacagawea was the only person for hundreds of miles who did. Part 3, The Making of the Corps, Lewis, Clark, and the Weight of Jefferson's Dream. There is a particular kind of cold that settles over the northern plains in January. It is not simply low temperature. It is a stillness, an absence, as if the air itself has frozen in place and the world has paused somewhere between one breath and the next. The Missouri River locks into ice so thick and clear you can see the dark water moving beneath it, sluggish and silent. The snow on the prairie has no texture, just an unbroken white that goes on until it becomes the sky, and it is impossible to say exactly where the land ends. This was the winter world Sacagawea shared, at some remove, across the short distance between the Hidatsa village and the American camp, with the Corps of Discovery during the winter of 1804 to 1805. To understand what she was stepping into when the expedition resumed in spring, it helps to understand what this enterprise was, and why it mattered so much to the people who had created it. Thomas Jefferson had dreamed of Western exploration for most of his adult life. He was a man of insatiable intellectual curiosity, and the unknown geography of the North American continent west of the Mississippi River was perhaps the greatest blank space in the map of his imagination. In 1803, through the astonishing purchase of the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon's France, 800,000 square miles of land for $15 million, one of the most consequential real estate transactions in human history, Jefferson suddenly had both the authority and the motive to send someone to look. He chose Meriwether Lewis, his personal secretary and a man he trusted deeply, to lead the expedition. Lewis was 30 years old in 1804. He was intelligent, scientifically literate, and personally courageous, though he was also prone to dark moods and a kind of melancholy that the wild country would both soothe and sometimes deepen. He chose William Clark as his co-commander, a choice that worked because Clark was, in almost every practical way, Lewis's complement. Where Lewis was introspective and sometimes erratic, Clark was steady, warm, and gifted with maps. Where Lewis wrote with lyrical intensity, Clark wrote with blunt clarity. Together, they made a whole person that neither one was separately. The Corps of Discovery, as the expedition was formally known, numbered around 30 to 40 people depending on the time and stage of the journey. There were soldiers, hunters, French boatmen, a man named York who was William Clark's enslaved companion and who would be among the first African Americans to cross the continent, and eventually, Charbonneau and Sacagawea. They had left the river port of Camp Du Bois, near St. Louis, in May of 1804. For the first several months of the journey, they were traveling through relatively familiar territory up the Missouri through what is now Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, and South Dakota, and they encountered dozens of native nations along the way. Lewis and Clark conducted formal meetings with tribal leaders, distributed gifts, delivered Jefferson's message of American sovereignty over the newly purchased territory, and collected information about the lands ahead. Some of these encounters were warm. Some were tense. The Teton Sioux, or Lakota, had a confrontation with the Corps that came close to violence. The Iroquois were cautious but hospitable. The Mandan and Hidatsa, when the expedition arrived at their villages in late October 1804, were welcoming, partly because of their long tradition of trade with outsiders, and partly because they understood the political value of cultivating relationships with the growing American presence on the river. During the winter at Fort Mandan, Lewis and Clark gathered as much information about the journey ahead as they could. They interviewed traders, asked questions of Mandan and Hidatsa leaders, and tried to piece together a picture of the geography between them and the Pacific. What they kept hearing was this: the land ahead was difficult. The Missouri River eventually ran out of navigable water. There were mountains, enormous mountains, far larger than anything in the eastern United States, that would need to be crossed on foot and horseback. And the only reliable source of horses in the region was the Shoshone people of the upper Missouri watershed. They needed a Shoshone interpreter. When they learned that Charbonneau's young wife had been born Shoshone, that she still spoke the language, that she knew the territory of the upper Missouri from her childhood, the decision was almost immediate. Charbonneau was hired as an interpreter, at a modest rate of pay, and Sacagawea came with him as an essential, if not formally compensated, part of the arrangement. What Lewis and Clark thought of her in those first weeks is only partially recorded. Lewis was somewhat reserved in his initial assessment, noting her usefulness without dwelling on her as an individual. Clark was, from the beginning, warmer. He would come to call her Janie in his journals, a nickname that suggests a kind of affection, though it also reflects the era's tendency to domesticate and diminish the people they depended upon. But the journals also record something else. They record moments when Sacagawea's knowledge, her presence, her calm, these things saved the expedition. Not once. Not twice. Many times. And those moments were still weeks away. On February 11, 1805, in the bitterest part of the Northern Plains winter, Sacagawea gave birth to a son. The labor was long and difficult. Lewis assisted in the delivery, and he noted in his journal that he gave her a small amount of rattlesnake rattle, ground up and dissolved in water, on the advice that it could hasten labor. Whether it helped or not, the child was born healthy. They named him Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. Clark, who had taken an immediate liking to the baby, nicknamed him Pomp or Pompey, a name that would follow the boy for years. He was perhaps the most widely traveled infant in the history of North America, carried on his mother's back across thousands of miles of some of the most demanding terrain on the continent. He was 6 weeks old when the expedition departed Fort Mandan in the spring. Sacagawea, with Pomp strapped to her back, walked west into the unknown. Part 4, Departure into the Unknown, the first miles west of Fort Mandan. There is something about a river at the beginning of spring that feels like permission. The ice breaks up noisily, with cracking sounds that carry across the flatland like something waking. The water runs high and fast and brown with the silt of the thaw. The cottonwoods along the banks begin to show the faintest green at the tips of their branches. The air still has winter in it, but underneath, there is something softer, something moving. On April 7, 1805, the Corps of Discovery left Fort Mandan and headed west. They traveled in a flotilla of small boats, 2 large pirogues and 6 dugout canoes loaded with supplies, scientific instruments, trade goods, weapons, food, and the accumulated paper records of everything they had observed and collected since leaving St. Louis. A small group of soldiers were sent back downriver to St. Louis with the boats that couldn't continue in the first installment of Lewis and Clark's journals and specimens for President Jefferson. Everything else pressed on. Lewis, in a rare moment of open feeling, wrote in his journal that evening that he was filled with a kind of joy he had not expected. He wrote that the expedition was at last fully underway, that the great enterprise they had been preparing for so long was truly beginning, and that he could not think of a spot of equal significance on earth at that moment. It was the language of a man stepping into his own story. And yet, from the very first days out of Fort Mandan, her contributions were constant and real. She identified plants along the banks and in the shallows, wild artichokes that rodents had cached in underground stores near the river, prairie turnips, wild licorice root, plants that Lewis carefully documented and collected for his specimens. She showed the men how to find and prepare foods that supplemented the expedition's provisions of dried corn, salt pork, and flour, foods that were running low in ways that would matter more and more as the journey progressed. The landscape around them was extraordinary. West of the Mandan villages, the character of the Missouri River changed. The valley narrowed and widened by turns. The bluffs became more dramatic, layered in pale clays and darker silts, striped with mineral colors, rust and cream and gray, that made the land look ancient in a geological way, as if you could read deep time in the walls of the canyon. The wildlife was astonishing. Lewis and Clark wrote about it with something approaching disbelief. Buffalo in herds that covered the prairie in every direction. Elk moving in groups of hundreds. Grizzly bears, animals the Eastern Expedition members had no experience with, lurking near the river, enormous and startlingly unafraid of humans. Prairie dogs, wolves, antelope, white pelicans on the sandbars. The expedition was traveling through one of the most concentrated ecosystems of large mammals in the world, and they were seeing it as it had existed for thousands of years, essentially undisturbed. The men were awed and sometimes frightened. The grizzlies in particular proved to be a revelation. Eastern black bears, which the soldiers knew, were shy and easily deterred. Grizzlies were different. They charged. They kept coming after being shot multiple times. Several terrifying encounters left the Corps members deeply shaken and with a new respect for the land they were passing through. For Sacagawea, this was still distant from home. The landscape of the upper Missouri was different from the mountain valleys of her childhood, but it had a familiar quality: the long open light, the smell of sage, the particular way the wind moved through the river breaks. And as they traveled west, the land was beginning to change in ways that she recognized, however distantly. Then came the incident that showed, more clearly than almost any other single moment, what Sacagawea's presence meant to this expedition. On May 14, 1805, a sudden squall struck one of the pirogues, the White Pirogue, which carried Lewis and Clark's most critical cargo, their papers, their instruments, their medicine, their trade goods, and nearly all of the specimens they had been collecting since St. Louis. The squall hit the sail, the boat lurched violently to one side, and the steersman, who happened to be Charbonneau, the weakest waterman on the expedition, prone to panic and crisis, let go of the rudder and began praying instead of steering. The boat went sideways. Water poured in. Equipment and supplies began to spill into the river. Men scrambled and shouted. Charbonneau, who could not swim, was nearly paralyzed with fear. Lewis, on the shore watching, nearly jumped into the water himself, and later wrote with barely contained rage about how close they came to losing everything. Sacagawea sat in the back of the pirogue. With the baby on her back and the boat tipping and the water coming in, she reached out calmly and began collecting the objects and papers and equipment that were floating past her and pulling them back into the boat. She did this methodically, steadily, with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. She recovered journals, navigational instruments, medicines, trade goods items whose loss would have crippled the expedition, perhaps ended it. Lewis wrote afterward, with evident gratitude, that Sacagawea had saved the contents of the boat and that her conduct was equal to that of any man on the expedition. It was high praise from a man who was not effortlessly generous with it. A few days later, as if in acknowledgement of that moment, Lewis named a tributary of the Missouri River after her. It appears on the maps they drew as Sacagawea or a near spelling. Small river. Cold, clear water coming down from the hills to the south. A name given as a kind of tribute, in the understated language of frontier geography. But the mountains were still ahead. And the hardest part of the journey was still to come. Part 5, The Great Falls and the Gates of the Mountains, the landscape becomes a test. There is a quality of endurance in the American West that is not romantic when you are inside it. It is simply hard. It is rocks and sun and the weight of what you are carrying and the distance between where you are and where you need to be, which is always farther than you thought yesterday. It is the way pain accumulates in a body that doesn't stop moving. It is thirst. It is feet that bleed. It is the flatness of the plains giving way to hills giving way to the first real mountains, and the mountains being much larger and much steeper than the maps suggested. By late May of 1805, the Corps of Discovery had traveled roughly 2 months and 1,000 miles west of Fort Mandan. The country around them was changing dramatically. The river was narrowing, running faster and colder. The bluffs were giving way to true canyon walls, gray limestone cliffs rising hundreds of feet above the water, streaked with mineral stains and topped with the dark shapes of eagles. Lewis, paddling ahead of the main party in late May, rounded a bend in the river and entered what he described as one of the most magnificent scenes in nature. He called it the Gates of the Rocky Mountains, a narrow canyon where the cliffs rose nearly 1,200 feet straight out of the water, so close together that the sky above was just a ribbon of blue, and the rock walls on either side were smooth and dark and seemed to lean toward each other overhead. He floated through in silence, the oars barely moving, and wrote that he felt something close to reverence. Sacagawea, moving through this landscape a few days later with the main party, was in familiar territory now, or rather, in the territory she was trying to recognize. The landmarks she remembered from childhood were beginning to appear. A particular bend in the river. The shape of a distant peak. The way the water sounded. She was reading the land the way someone returning to a childhood home reads the features of the old neighborhood, watching for what is the same as they remembered. On June 3, the expedition reached the first of the major obstacles that had been described to them by their Mandan and Hidatsa informants, a spot where the river forked unexpectedly into 2 branches of nearly equal size. The Marias River entered the Missouri from the north, and the Missouri itself continued to the southwest. Which branch was the true Missouri? Which one led to the mountains, to the great falls that the informants had described, and ultimately to the headwaters they needed to reach? It mattered enormously. Taking the wrong fork would cost them days or weeks, time they could not afford, because the window between the mountain snowmelt and the first autumn snowfall in the Rockies was narrow. If they were still in the mountains when winter came, they would not survive. Lewis and Clark disagreed with nearly every other man in the Corps. The men, experienced woodsmen and rivermen, all looked at the two forks and concluded unanimously that the North Fork, the Marias, was the true Missouri. It was bigger, it was murkier, it ran the color of Missouri water they recognized. The South Fork was clear, cold, running fast over rocks. It didn't look like a large plains river. Lewis and Clark were convinced, for reasons partly geological, partly intuitive, partly based on their Mandan informant's descriptions of the falls ahead, that the South Fork was the true river. They were right. And they were almost alone in believing it. They explored both forks, came back, made their decision, and headed south. And within a few days, Lewis, hiking overland ahead of the party, heard a low roaring sound and smelled a fine mist in the air and came over a rise to see the great falls of the Missouri, 5 separate cataracts in a 10-mile stretch, the largest dropping 80 feet in a curtain of white water and spray that soaked him through before he even reached the bank. He wrote about it at length. He wrote that he wished he had a better pen, and then a better pen than that one. He wrote that language was inadequate to the scene. It is some of his best writing. The Great Falls were beautiful. They were also a catastrophe, operationally speaking. The boats could not go over them. The Corps had to portage, to carry the boats and all their supplies overland around the falls, a distance of roughly 18 miles through terrain that was broken, rocky, sun-baked, and populated with prickly pear cactus and rattlesnakes. The portage took nearly a month. It was perhaps the most physically brutal stretch of the entire journey. The men built crude wooden carts, wheels made from the cross-sections of a cottonwood log, and dragged the heavy dugout canoes across the prairie in the summer heat. The prickly pear spines went through their moccasins. The rattlesnakes were everywhere. One afternoon, a storm came up suddenly and produced hail the size of golf balls that knocked men off their feet and left them bleeding and bruised, crouched behind whatever shelter they could find, shielding their heads with their hands. Sacagawea was ill during the portage. Seriously ill. Lewis noted it with evident concern. She had a fever, severe pain in her lower abdomen, and at times seemed barely conscious. He treated her with the medicines he had: opium pills, bark teas, mineral water from a local spring, and sat with her in the shade, checking her pulse, worrying. She had the baby with her. Always. Through the fever and the heat and the illness, Pomp was there, perhaps nursing, perhaps carried by the other members of the Corps, but never far from his mother. Lewis wrote with quiet, genuine emotion that he feared he would lose her. And he seemed to understand, though perhaps not fully articulate, what losing her would mean for the expedition. Without Sacagawea, there was no Shoshone interpreter. Without a Shoshone interpreter, there was no way to negotiate for horses. Without horses, there was no way over the mountains. She recovered. Slowly, over several days, the fever broke and she began to eat again and sit up and look around with her dark eyes and take an interest in the world around her. By the time the portage was finally complete, she was walking again. And ahead, at last, were the mountains. Part 6, Coming Home, the recognition at the Three Forks and the meeting with the Shoshone. The headwaters of the Missouri River in the high summer of 1805 are cold in a way that only mountain water is cold. There is a bite to it that goes past your skin and into your bones. The river is narrow here, barely more than a stream in places, running clear over pale gravel beds. The mountains rise above you on every side, massive, blue-gray, snow-capped even in July, and the sky above the peaks has the deep, saturated blue that only exists at altitude, where the air is thin and the light is different. The core of discovery reached the three forks of the Missouri, the point where three rivers met to form the Missouri proper, on July 25, 1805. Lewis and Clark named them the Jefferson, the Madison, and the Gallatin, after the president and two cabinet members, in the habitual way of explorers who assert possession through nomenclature. But for Sacagawea, standing at the confluence of those three cold rivers, this was not a discovery. This was a memory. She had been here before. She had been a child here, perhaps 11 years old, on that terrible day when the Hidatsa raiders came and the world she knew came apart. She recognized this place. She had carried it inside her, in the geography of grief, for 5 or 6 years. Lewis noted in his journal, without particular dramatic emphasis, that Sacagawea had informed them with great composure that this was the very spot where the Hidatsa had attacked her people, and that she seemed entirely unmoved, displaying no emotion of sorrow and recollecting events which must have been extremely painful to her. He seemed to find this remarkable admirable, even, in the stoic way that he admired things. It is worth pausing here to think about what he was actually observing. Sacagawea was a young woman, perhaps 16 or 17, standing at the site of one of the most traumatic events of her life. She was surrounded by men who did not share her language, in a formal and hierarchical context where expressing personal emotion would have been neither welcomed nor understood. She was carrying a baby. She was part of a military expedition with very specific objectives, and she understood her role in meeting those objectives. What Lewis read as composure was almost certainly something more complex. It was the presence of someone who has learned to carry pain internally, to function through grief, to move forward even when the ground beneath you is saturated with sorrow. It was not absence of feeling. It was the management of feeling in conditions that did not allow for its expression. From the Three Forks, they followed the Jefferson River, the southwestern branch, upward into the mountains. The going was slow and painful. The boats were nearly useless in water this shallow and fast. The men hauled them through the shallows, wading in ice-cold water up to their waists, fighting the current, scraping the hulls on rocks, making sometimes only a few miles per day. They needed horses. Desperately. And somewhere in these mountains, there were Shoshone people with horses to trade. But they couldn't find them. The Shoshone, who had long experience of the dangers of being found by strangers, Hidatsa raiders, Blackfeet warriors, all manner of threat from the eastern plains, were very good at not being seen when they didn't want to be seen. Lewis went ahead with a small advance party, trying to make contact. He walked up through the mountains, crossed the Continental Divide at Lemhi Pass, and became, in that moment, one of the first United States citizens to stand on the far side of the Rocky Mountain watershed. The water on the eastern slope of that pass flowed eventually to the Atlantic. The water on the western slope flowed to the Pacific. He stood at the top, breathing thin air, looking west, and saw not the single short chain of mountains he had hoped for, but another range behind the first, and behind that, another, and the ranges going on westward in layered ridges almost beyond counting. His heart must have sunk a little. This was going to be much harder than anyone had imagined. He came down the western slope of Lemhi Pass and, after a tense and careful approach, finally made contact with a band of Shoshone people, the very band, as it turned out, of the Agaidika Shoshone. The Shoshone he met were nervous and uncertain. They had no good reason to trust strangers arriving from the east. Lewis communicated with signs, offered gifts, and gradually convinced the band's leader, a man named Midway, that his intentions were peaceful and that there was a woman traveling with his larger party who was Shoshone-born. It was an extraordinary card to play, and it worked. Midway agreed to come back with Lewis to meet the main party, though with evident suspicion and some of his warriors ready to flee at the first sign of a trap. What happened when the full corps of Discovery met the Shoshone band is one of the most astonishing moments in the history of this expedition. Sacagawea was called forward to interpret. She walked toward the group of Shoshone people, began to speak, and then stopped. She looked at the man who was the band's chief. She recognized him. Midway was her brother. She had not seen him since she was 11 years old and was taken captive. 6 years of separation, of captivity, of distance measured in hundreds of miles, and an entirely different life. And now here he was, standing in front of her in the mountain valley they had both grown up in. Lewis recorded the scene with genuine feeling. He wrote that Sacagawea ran to the man and embraced him and began to weep, wrapping her blanket around him in the gesture of Shoshone affection between close relations, and that her tears continued to flow for some time, and that even the most hardened of the corps members were moved. She composed herself, eventually. She had to. There was interpreting to be done, the fate of the expedition depended on these negotiations proceeding, and she was the only person who could do it. She sat down and began translating, and several times she had to stop because the tears overtook her again, and then she collected herself and continued. It is one of the most human moments in all of American history. A young woman, far from home, at the center of a geopolitical expedition, suddenly face to face with the family she had lost and mourned and carried in memory through years of displacement. And she translated. She did her job. Because the expedition needed her and she understood that, and because she was that kind of person. The negotiations with Midway were ultimately successful. The Shoshone agreed to sell horses and to provide a guide who knew the trail over the mountains. But the path ahead was going to be steep and cold and very, very long. Part 7, Over the Mountains, the Crossing of the Bitterroot Range. The Bitterroot Mountains in September are a world of cold and silence. The lodgepole pines grow close together on the steep slopes, their bark rough and gray, and the forest floor between them is carpeted with the brown needles of many years and the low-growing huckleberry that has already turned red and shed its leaves by then. The trail, if you can call it a trail, follows the ridgeline in a way that seems to ignore the concept of comfortable elevation, going up sharply and then up again, always up, into thinner air and colder wind. The route the Corps of Discovery took over the Bitterroot Range in late September of 1805 was one the Shoshone guide they called Old Toby knew by experience and memory. It was the Lolo Trail, a route the Nez Perce people used seasonally to cross from their western homeland to the buffalo hunting grounds of the eastern plains. It was old. It was established. It was also, by almost any standard, nearly impossible. The expedition had acquired 29 horses from the Shoshone, and the horses made it possible to carry the heaviest supplies. But the trail was often so steep and the terrain so uncertain that the horses slipped and fell, some of them rolling and sliding down the mountain slopes before catching themselves or coming to rest against a tree. Equipment was lost. One horse fell into a creek with its cargo and nearly drowned before the men cut it free of the pack. The cold was the deeper enemy. They had entered the mountains at the end of the summer window, and the season turned against them almost immediately. Snow came early, first a dusting on the high ridges, then serious snowfall that covered the trail and made navigation treacherous. The temperature dropped below freezing at night and barely climbed above it during the day. The men's hands and feet were numb from the cold and the wet. The food ran out. This is the hardest part to sit with, the fact that during the crossing of the bitter roots, the core of Discovery came genuinely close to starvation. The game was scarce in the dense forest of the high ridges. The hunters went out each day and came back with little or nothing. The men began slaughtering the horses, first one, then others, both for food and, in the case of one horse, to make a broth for the sick. They ate candles. They ate the portable soup, a kind of concentrated meat paste they had brought from the east, that they had been carrying for exactly such emergencies. It was not enough. Men grew weak and disoriented. Some developed dysentery from the sudden change in diet and the stress on their bodies. Clark, writing in his journal by the light of a fire in the thin, cold mountain air, noted that several men were so exhausted they could barely continue. Sacagawea was not exempt from this suffering. She was walking these same mountains, carrying pomp, eating the same inadequate rations, sleeping in the same cold camps. But she was also doing something the others could not do. She was recognizing the landscape. She had not been on this particular trail, the Lolo Trail was north of her Agaitica homeland, but she had been in mountains like these. She knew mountain country. She knew how to move through it, when to conserve energy and when to push, how to read the terrain for shelter and for the signs of water and game. Her presence in the group was a kind of quiet anchor, not because she was giving orders or directing the route, but because she was calm in a place that seemed designed to produce panic. After 11 days on the bitter route crossing, 11 days of cold and hunger and steep terrain and early snow and faltering horses, the Corps came down off the western slopes of the mountains onto the Weippe Prairie, in what is now the panhandle of Idaho, and encountered their first Nez Perce people. The Nez Perce saved them. It is not too strong a word. The Nez Perce people, the Nyamipu, as they called themselves, took in these bedraggled, half-starved, frost-bitten strangers and fed them. Dried salmon. Camas root bread. Foods that were rich in nutrients and calories and warmth. The men ate so much so fast that many of them became violently ill, their shrunken stomachs overwhelmed by the sudden richness of the food after days of near fasting. But they ate, and they warmed themselves by fires, and they recovered. It was, again, the kindness of indigenous peoples that made the expedition possible. This is a theme that runs through the entire story of Lewis and Clark in a way that the popular historical narrative sometimes underplays. At nearly every critical juncture, the Mandan winter, the Shoshone horses, the Nez Perce rescue, native peoples provided the knowledge, the food, the shelter, and the guidance that allowed this American expedition to survive. For Sacagawea, the mountains were crossed. What lay ahead was the long river journey west to the ocean. Part 8, down the Columbia, the final push to the Pacific. The Clearwater River runs clear and cold and very fast off the western slopes of the Rockies, dropping quickly toward the Snake River and from there to the Columbia and the sea. The Corps of Discovery built new canoes at a campsite the Nez Perce called Canoe Camp, rough dugouts made from the large ponderosa pines, carved out of the greenwood with fire and adze in a technique they partly learned from the Nez Perce, and launched themselves west in October of 1805, moving now with the current, moving fast. After the grinding slowness of the mountain crossing, the river felt like flight. They covered distances in days that would have taken weeks on foot. The landscape unrolled around them, from the dense pine forests of the Idaho Panhandle to the open, dramatic basalt canyon country of the Snake River, the dark volcanic cliffs rising on both sides of the water, the sage and bunch grass replacing the pines as they descended toward the Columbia Plateau. The rivers of the inland Northwest were full of salmon in autumn, Pacific salmon running upstream from the ocean in their annual migrations, so thick in places that the water seemed more fish than water. The indigenous peoples of the region, the Nez Perce, the Walla Walla, the Umatilla, had built their entire economy and culture around these runs, and the Corps moved through a landscape of busy fishing camps and drying racks loaded with fish, village after village of peoples who had been trading along these rivers for centuries. Sacagawea's presence continued to matter in ways that were subtle but significant. Lewis and Clark had noted early in the expedition that the appearance of a woman with the party was, in itself, a form of communication. War parties did not travel with women and infants. Her presence signaled peaceful intention in a way that no amount of waving and gift-giving could achieve as quickly or as clearly. She also continued to identify edible plants and roots, to provide translation through the chain of languages. She spoke Shoshone, which Charbonneau translated into French, which one of the French-speaking soldiers translated into English, and to navigate the complex social dynamics of encountering so many different peoples in rapid succession. The Columbia River, which the Corps reached in mid-October 1805, where the Snake River joined it, was another revelation. It was enormous. Even more enormous than the Missouri had been. And it ran through a landscape that grew stranger and more dramatic the farther west they went. The Columbia Gorge, the deep canyon the river carved through the Cascade Range, was a world of mist and dark basalt and enormous waterfalls tumbling in from the canyon walls above. The Douglas fir trees were so large the men could not wrap their arms around them. Mosses hung from every surface in shades of green so vivid they seemed almost unnatural. The air was wet and smelled of rain and cedar. On November 7, 1805, Clark wrote in his journal the words that have become perhaps the most famous line of the entire expedition's documentary record: "Great joy in camp we are in view of the ocean, this great Pacific Ocean which we've been so long anxious to see." The spelling, as always with Clark, was enthusiastically idiosyncratic. The feeling was clear. They had done it. They had crossed the continent. For Sacagawea, standing at the edge of the estuary, this was the farthest point from home she had ever been. She had been born in mountain valleys 1,500 miles to the east. She had been taken, as a child, to the Missouri River. She had traveled west across the plains and over the mountains to the Pacific. She had seen more of the North American continent than almost any person alive at that moment, in any culture. And the ocean was not yet done with them. The winter at Fort Clatsop, the rough log post the Corps built near the mouth of the Columbia in November and December of 1805, was miserable in the way that coastal Pacific Northwest winters are miserable, not brutally cold, but relentlessly wet. It rained nearly every day. The elk they hunted for food was lean and stringy. The men were plagued by fleas from the coastal peoples' camps they visited. Clothing rotted. Leather mildewed. But even here, Sacagawea's preferences were noted. The Corps decided to take a vote, a remarkable, if unofficial, democratic exercise about where to spend the winter camp, whether on the north bank of the Columbia or the south. Clark's journals record that every member of the party was consulted about their preference. Every member. Including York, the enslaved man who had no legal personhood under American law. And including Sacagawea, who was neither a soldier nor a citizen. She voted. She expressed a preference for the south side of the river, where she had been told there was more game and better conditions. The south side was chosen. It is a tiny detail. But it is a window into something real, that within the working culture of the Corps of Discovery, on the far edge of the continent in the winter of 1805, Sacagawea was regarded as a member. Not as property, not as a symbol, but as a person whose opinion on practical matters was worth having. Then she asked for something. A dead whale had washed ashore on the coast south of Fort Clatsop, a massive carcass that the coastal Clatsop people were processing for food and oil. When she learned that a party was going to go see it, she asked, directly, to be included. She said that she had traveled a long way to see the ocean, and that she very much wished to see the great ocean and this monstrous fish. Clark agreed. She went. She saw the ocean. She stood on the beach and looked at the Pacific, gray and immense under the winter clouds, and the whale carcass was 85 feet long and already being worked over by the Tillamook people. And whatever she felt in that moment, wonder, grief, exhaustion, something like freedom, something like completion, she took it with her. Part 9, The Long Road Home Eastward in 1806. Spring on the Pacific coast of what is now Oregon comes in shades of green so deep and saturated they seem to absorb light rather than reflect it. The salal and sword fern and young alder brush cover the ground in a thick carpet, and the morning fog comes off the ocean and settles in the valleys, and the rivers run high and fast with the snow melt from the Cascades, and everything smells of growth and wet earth and the sea. The Corps of Discovery left Fort Clatsop on March 23, 1806, and turned east. They were going home. The return journey was in some ways harder than the outward one, not because the terrain was different, but because the Corps was worn. The men were thin and tired. Their equipment was deteriorating. The winter of rain and poor food had taken a toll on everyone's health. And the mountains they had crossed once, they would have to cross again. But the journey home also had its own discoveries and its own human texture, and Sacagawea's role in it was no less important than it had been on the way out. Going back up the Columbia, the Corps encountered many of the same peoples they had met on the way down, and the relationships they had formed carefully, imperfectly, with gifts and diplomacy and the universal language of shared meals, made the return passage easier in many places. The Walla Walla leader Yellowpit met them warmly, provided horses, and facilitated an overland shortcut that saved the Corps several days. As they moved back east and upward toward the Bitterroot Mountains, they rejoined the Nez Perce, who had agreed to hold the Corps' horses through the winter and who now returned them in good condition. The Nez Perce became, over the weeks of waiting for the mountain snowpack to melt sufficiently for the Lolo Trail to be passable, something like companions. There were horse races, games, shared meals, the exchange of medical services and information. Sacagawea served repeatedly as a cultural bridge in these weeks, not as a formal interpreter, since she did not speak Nez Perce, but as a presence and as a participant in the social interactions that built the goodwill the Corps depended on. She prepared foods, she cared for the sick, she watched and listened with the intelligence that was her most consistent and enduring gift. When the Lolo Trail finally became passable in late June after one failed attempt in early June, when the snowpack was still too deep, the expedition crossed the Bitterroots again in 5 days, compared to the 11 agonizing days of the outward crossing. The difference was knowledge. They knew the route now, they had Nez Perce guides for part of it, and the weather cooperated. At Traveler's Rest, near what is now Missoula, Montana, Lewis and Clark split the expedition temporarily. Lewis took a northern route to explore the Marias River. Clark took a southern route, heading back through the Three Forks region and then south and east to the Yellowstone River. Sacagawea traveled with Clark's party. And here, on the return journey, she performed one final, essential act of navigation that has sometimes been overshadowed by the earlier, more dramatic moments of the expedition. As Clark's party approached the Yellowstone from the south, they needed to find the best route through the mountains between the Jefferson River Valley and the Yellowstone drainage. There were multiple possible passes, and choosing the wrong one could cost days. Sacagawea knew this country. She had hunted here as a child, and the mental map she carried of the terrain between the Rocky Mountain headwaters and the Yellowstone Valley was detailed and reliable. She guided Clark's party through Bozeman Pass, a low gap in the mountains that is still used today by a major interstate highway, to the Yellowstone River without difficulty. Clark noted in his journal that his Indian woman, who had been of great service to him as a pilot through this country, had recognized the pass and guided them through it with great certainty and ease. It is a quiet sentence in a long journal, but it captures something essential about the entire nature of her contribution. She was not a performer or a symbol. She was a navigator, a knower of the land, a person with irreplaceable knowledge, given quietly and efficiently in the service of an enterprise that was not, in the deepest sense, her own, but that she served with a kind of dignity that the journals, in their best moments, recognize. The Corps reunited at the confluence of the Yellowstone and the Missouri, floated down the Missouri through familiar country, and arrived back at the Mandan and Hidatsa villages in August of 1806. And there, at the Knife River villages, Sacagawea's role in the Corps of Discovery officially ended. She was home. Or at least, she was in the closest thing to a home that her displaced life had given her. Part 10, After the Journey, What the World Made of Sacagawea, and What She Made of Herself. The Missouri River below the Mandan villages runs fast in August, swollen with the summer rains, and the cottonwoods along the banks are still in full leaf, shading the water in pools of shadow and light. Toussaint Charbonneau was paid for his services, $533.33, plus a modest land grant. His horse and his tent were returned to him. He received a formal letter of thanks from Lewis and Clark. Sacagawea received nothing. Not $1, not a land grant, not a formal acknowledgement of her service in the official correspondence that went to Washington. This is the reality of her historical position. She was essential, she was present, she was noticed, and she was not, in the formal economy of the American government, compensable. She was a woman. She was native. She was the wife of the interpreter. She was, by the legal and cultural standards of 1806, invisible. Clark, who had formed what seems to have been a genuine personal regard for both Sacagawea and her son, wrote to Charbonneau after the expedition with an offer that was both touching and revealing of the era's contradictions. He offered to raise and educate Pomp, to bring the boy to St. Louis, give him an education, and provide for his future. He wrote with evident warmth about the beautiful, promising child and expressed his wish for Pomp's welfare in terms that suggest real affection. It took several years. The family eventually did travel to St. Louis, and Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau Pomp was indeed educated there, in the Catholic school system Clark arranged and funded. He grew up to be a remarkable person in his own right, fluent in multiple languages, an experienced mountain man, a guide and trapper who eventually traveled to Europe and spent years in Germany as the companion of a German prince who found the American West fascinating. He lived a long, improbable, adventurous life and died in 1866. But his mother's life after 1806 is less clear. Much less clear. And this ambiguity has become one of the central mysteries of her story. There are two competing historical traditions about what happened to Sacagawea after the expedition. The first tradition holds that she died young, probably around 1812, at Fort Manuel Lisa, a fur trading post on the Missouri River in what is now South Dakota. A clerk at the fort, John Luddig, recorded on December 20, 1812, that the wife of Charbonneau, a snake squaw, had died at the fort of a putrid fever. She was described as young and beloved, the best woman in the fort. Scholars generally believe this was Sacagawea, and this tradition places her death at approximately 24 years of age. The second tradition comes from the Shoshone oral tradition of the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. This tradition holds that Sacagawea did not die in 1812 but instead eventually left Charbonneau, returned west, lived for many years among various peoples including the Comanche, and eventually came home to the Shoshone people in Wyoming, where she lived to old age, dying in 1884 at approximately 96 years of age. A woman named Porivo on the Wind River Reservation, known to her community as having been part of a great journey to the east long ago, is identified in this tradition as Sacagawea. Historians debate these two traditions with genuine uncertainty. The documentary evidence favors the 1812 death. The oral tradition and some circumstantial evidence support the later date. The truth may never be fully knowable, and that not knowing is itself meaningful. It is part of the story of how thoroughly her life was documented on everyone else's terms, in everyone else's language, and how incompletely her own experience was ever recorded in ways that survived. What we do know is that the world moved on quickly, and largely forgot her. For nearly a century after the expedition, Sacagawea was a relatively minor figure in the popular telling of the Lewis and Clark story. The expedition was celebrated, but the celebration centered on Lewis and Clark themselves, on the heroism of the American soldiers, on the narrative of westward expansion. The indigenous people who made the expedition possible, the Mandan who sheltered them, the Shoshone who provided horses, the Nez Perce who rescued them from starvation, the Clatsop who traded with them at the coast, were supporting characters in someone else's story. That began to change in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, largely through the work of women's suffrage advocates who saw in Sacagawea a powerful historical symbol. Eva Emery Dye's 1902 novel The Conquest popularized a romanticized version of Sacagawea as a heroic guide who was personally responsible for leading Lewis and Clark across the continent, a characterization that overstated some aspects of her role while honoring the genuine importance of her contributions. The suffragists of the early 20th century embraced her image enthusiastically. Statues were commissioned. States competed for the honor of claiming her as a native daughter. She was placed on a dollar coin in 2000. She has appeared on more statues in the United States than any other woman, more than any founding father, more than any historical figure except perhaps Abraham Lincoln. This popularity has its own complexity. The image of Sacagawea that became popular, young, beautiful, arm-raised, pointing west, leading the way, is partly romantic projection, a figure shaped by what the culture needed her to be rather than what she actually was. She was not primarily a guide in the geographic sense. She was not Lewis and Clark's personal compass. She was an interpreter, a cultural mediator, a plant expert, a person whose knowledge of specific landscapes was invaluable in specific moments. She was also a traumatized captive turned into a wife by a man with significant power over her. She was also a loving mother. She was also a person of extraordinary capability and quiet courage. She was all of these things simultaneously, and none of the statues capture all of it, because statues don't. What matters, at the end, is this: in the journals of Lewis and Clark, imperfect documents written by imperfect men in an imperfect time, there is genuine evidence of a person who was capable, calm, and irreplaceable. Who crossed a continent with a baby on her back and her grief inside her and her knowledge given freely. Who stood at the edge of the Pacific Ocean and asked to see the whale. Who voted, informally, in what may have been the most geographically remote democratic exercise in American history. She did not conquer the West. She knew it. And knowing it, she shared it. Part 11, The Land Itself, What the Journey Showed About a Continent and Its Peoples. There is a morning light in the Rocky Mountain West, in that hour just after dawn when the sun first clears the eastern ridgeline and falls low and golden across everything, that makes the land look like it is being seen for the first time. The Lewis and Clark expedition is sometimes presented in American history as a journey of discovery, the first time human eyes fell on these landscapes, the first human feet to walk these trails. This is, of course, not remotely true. The continent had been inhabited for at least 15,000 years before the expedition, and the peoples who lived in the lands Lewis and Clark traveled through had been observing, studying, naming, and navigating those landscapes for all of that time. What Lewis and Clark's journey actually represented was something different. It was the first time these landscapes, these peoples, these plants and animals and rivers and mountains were systematically documented in the recording tradition of the Western scientific and political world. And that documentation had enormous and complicated consequences, not all of them good, for the people and places it described. The journals Lewis and Clark produced are remarkable documents. They contain something like 700 botanical specimens collected and described, many of them new to Western science. They contain detailed descriptions of over 200 animal species, including the grizzly bear, the mountain goat, the pronghorn antelope, and the prairie dog, which were unknown or poorly understood by Eastern science. They contain ethnographic notes on at least 50 native nations, with observations about language, social organization, ceremonial life, trade practices, and political structures. They are also documents shot through with the assumptions and limitations of their time. The native peoples they encountered are often described in terms drawn from European evolutionary theory as more or less civilized, more or less savage, more or less docile. The complex political landscapes of the northern plains, the alliances, the trade networks, the histories of conflict and cooperation between different nations are sometimes reduced to simple categories that serve the expedition's political purposes rather than reflecting the full reality. Jefferson's instructions to Lewis included establishing American sovereignty over all the peoples and territories the expedition passed through, an assertion that was, from any indigenous perspective, extraordinary in its presumption. The peoples Lewis and Clark met had not consented to being governed by the United States. They had not sold their land in the Louisiana Purchase. France had sold it, land that France had claimed but had never actually controlled, land that had been home to dozens of nations for thousands of years. The transaction was, from any indigenous legal perspective, meaningless. But its consequences were not meaningless. The expedition opened the door, quite literally, by documenting routes and resources and describing the layout of peoples and their settlements, to the westward expansion that would transform the continent in the following century. The fur trade intensified. The first American trading posts appeared on the upper Missouri. The missionaries arrived. The settlers came, first in trickles and then in rivers, following the trails that Lewis and Clark had mapped and the rivers they had charted. The people's Sacagawea's journey brought the expedition through her own Shoshone people, the Hidatsa who had captured her, the Mandan who sheltered the expedition, the Nez Perce who rescued them from starvation. All of them faced, in the following decades, the full force of that expansion. Epidemic disease. The loss of land through treaties that were rarely honored. The destruction of the buffalo herds that had sustained plains cultures for generations. The violence of military campaigns. The forced removal of children from families into boarding schools. A century of policies designed, explicitly, to eliminate indigenous culture and replace it with assimilation. To sit with the beauty of the Lewis and Clark expedition, the extraordinary landscapes, the human courage, the scientific achievement, without also sitting with what it made possible is to tell an incomplete story. And incomplete stories are the most dangerous kind, because they have the appearance of truth. Sacagawea understood, perhaps better than any other member of the Corps, that she was part of something that had two sides. Her knowledge, her presence, her work, these things served the expedition, and the expedition served the expansion, and the expansion would eventually reach back and change the world her own people lived in. We cannot know what she thought about this. She left no written record. But she was not a simple person, and her situation was not a simple one, and the idea that she was merely an innocent helper who didn't understand what she was part of does her the same injustice as the statue that shows her only pointing west. She was a human being of considerable intelligence, moving through a world that offered her very limited choices, making the best use of those choices she could. She kept herself alive. She kept her child alive. She helped an expedition survive. And she carried, through all of it, the knowledge of a landscape and a people that would be changed utterly by the very enterprise she was part of. That complexity does not diminish her. It deepens her. The land itself, the specific land she walked through, went on existing after the expedition left it. The Missouri River continued to run its dark, silted course to the Mississippi. The Three Forks continued their cold convergence in the mountain meadow. The Lemhi Pass continued to sit at the top of the Continental Divide, the water on one side flowing east and the water on the other side flowing west, indifferent to borders and expeditions and the political aspirations of young nations. The land remembers in the only way land can remember, by continuing to be itself. The light still falls golden and low in the mountain valleys in late summer. The salmon still run in the rivers, though in far smaller numbers than they once did. The sage still smells of dry heat and distance. The high passes are still cold in September, still capable of delivering snow in the same weeks when the expedition shivered and struggled across the bitter roots. And somewhere in that landscape, in the shape of the mountains and the behavior of the rivers, is the memory of every person who ever passed through it. The Shoshone who fished the Lemhi tributaries for centuries before Sacagawea was born. The Nez Perce who walked the Lolo Trail in autumn to hunt buffalo on the eastern plains. The young woman who crossed from one world into another and brought with her the knowledge of everything she had ever seen. The land holds all of it, in its way. And it is still there, waiting. Part 12, Legacy, Memory, and the Quiet Power of a Name. There is something particular about the way history treats the people it needs but does not know how to hold. It tends to make them into symbols before it makes them into people. It tends to reduce the complexity of a life into the clarity of a single image: an arm pointing west, a face turned toward the horizon, a name on a coin or a statue or a national park visitor center. The symbol is easier to carry than the person. The symbol doesn't complicate the story. Sacagawea has been made into more symbols than almost any other person in American history. She has been made into a symbol of Native American courage and resilience. She has been made into a symbol of women's capability and strength. She has been made into a symbol of peaceful relations between indigenous and European American peoples, and into a symbol of the opposite of the ways in which indigenous peoples were used and discarded by the expanding American nation. She has been made into a symbol of the American West itself, that vast, complicated, beautiful, terrible space that the nation spent a century trying to claim and a century after that trying to understand. All of these symbolic uses contain some truth. And all of them are incomplete. Because the actual person, the girl born in the Lemhi Valley around 1788, the captive carried east by Hidatsa raiders, the teenage mother who crossed the continent with an infant on her back, the woman who stood on the shore of the Pacific and looked west, that person was more interesting, more contradicted, more fully human than any symbol can accommodate. Let us stay with some of the details that the symbols tend to leave out. She was never, in the formal records of the expedition, given the title of guide. She was never paid. She was never officially recognized by the United States government in any formal capacity. The Lewis and Clark journals, which are the primary record of her life during the period we know most about, refer to her mostly as the Indian woman or Charbonneau's wife or, in Clark's warmer moments, as Janie. Her name, which appears in a dozen different spellings across the journals Sacagawea, Sacagawea, and many others, was never standardized in her own lifetime. The question of how her name should be pronounced, and what it actually means, has been debated by linguists and historians for over a century. The Hidatsa language tradition gives us Sacagawea, meaning bird woman, and this is the spelling preferred by the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation of North Dakota, who regard her as part of their cultural heritage. The Shoshone linguistic tradition gives us Sacagawea, with a slightly different phonetic structure, and this is the spelling preferred by many Shoshone people and by the state of Wyoming, where the oral tradition of her later life is centered. The spelling Sacagawea, the most commonly used in American textbooks and popular culture, is essentially a 19th century compromise that doesn't perfectly match either tradition. This small linguistic argument is not trivial. It is, in miniature, the entire argument about who gets to name things and whose traditions are authoritative. It is the same argument that runs through the whole history of indigenous and European-American relations in North America, expressed in the most intimate possible form, the question of what a person's name actually is, and who has the right to decide. Her son, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, went on to an extraordinary life that deserves a moment of its own. Educated in St. Louis under Clark's patronage, he became fluent in English, French, Spanish, and German, in addition to the indigenous languages he had absorbed in childhood. When he was 18, he met Prince Paul Wilhelm of Württemberg, a German nobleman traveling in the American West with the romantic fascination that European aristocrats of the era brought to frontier culture, and the two formed an unlikely friendship. Jean-Baptiste went to Europe and spent 6 years there, moving in aristocratic circles, learning the manners and languages of a world utterly unlike the one he had been born into on the northern plains. He returned to America and became a mountain man and guide in the tradition of the great western frontiersman, spending decades in the Rocky Mountain fur trade, guiding military expeditions, working as a scout, and living the restless, mobile life that seemed to be encoded in his experience from the very beginning. He was, in a sense, a man who could move between worlds because he had always existed at the intersection of multiple worlds, Shoshone and Hidatsa and French-Canadian and American and European. He died in 1866 in Oregon, still moving. Whether his mother lived to see any of his later life depends on which historical tradition you accept. If the 1812 death record is correct, she died when he was about 7 years old, and he grew up in Clark's care having lost her very young. If the Shoshone oral tradition is correct, she lived long enough to know him as a grown man and to have returned, eventually, to the people she had started from. Both versions are haunted in their own way. The first is a story of early loss, a mother who gave everything for an expedition that gave her nothing, and who died young in a trading post on the river, far from the mountains she grew up in. The second is a story of survival against extraordinary odds, a woman who endured captivity and displacement and an unwanted marriage and a transcontinental journey and somehow found her way back, in the end, to her own people. The historian must hold both possibilities with honesty. The human listener, settling in for the long dark of the night, might simply hold both with something like tenderness. The statues are everywhere now. There is a famous one in Bismarck, North Dakota, by sculptor Leonard Crunell, installed in 1910, one of the earliest major monuments to her. There is one in Portland, Oregon, by Alice Cooper, not the rock musician, but a female sculptor of the early 20th century, that shows her with pomp on her back, which was groundbreaking for its time and representing the baby as integral to her story. There are statues in Sacagawea State Park in Washington, in Idaho, in Montana, in Wyoming. There are schools and parks and rivers and mountain peaks named for her across the American West. The Sacagawea dollar coin, introduced in 2000 by the United States Mint, has her face, a face imagined and modeled, since no portrait of her exists, by a Shoshone-Bannock student named Randy L. Hidao-Teton, who posed for the sculptor Glenna Goodacker. The face on the coin is therefore a modern Shoshone woman's face, which has its own kind of rightness. The coin is golden-colored, slightly larger than a quarter, and it spent most of its existence accumulating in post office drawers and piggy banks rather than circulating widely, which is perhaps its own kind of metaphor. In 2001, she was named an honorary sergeant in the United States Army, posthumously. In a ceremony more than a century and a half after the expedition, she served without pay or rank or formal recognition. It was a gesture, and gestures have their place, though the gap between the gesture and the reality of her experience is still wide enough to walk through. The Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail, a route that follows, approximately, the path of the expedition from Illinois to Oregon, passes through landscapes that are in some cases remarkably unchanged from what the Corps encountered. There are places along the upper Missouri where you can stand on a bluff and look out over a bend in the river and see what Lewis saw when he wrote about magnificent scenes. There are places along the Lolo Trail where the lodgepole pines and the rocky ridgeline look exactly as they would have in 1805. There are places on the Lemhi Pass where the view west, over the ranges of the Rockies, is still the same overwhelming horizon of mountains. People walk these trails now. Slowly, with good boots and water bottles and satellite navigation, they walk the routes that were walked in moccasins and worn army boots by people who had no way to know exactly where they were going. And sometimes, in the particular quality of light on the mountain grass, or in the sound of a cold tributary running fast over smooth rocks, or in the smell of sage and afternoon heat, something ancient and irreducible makes itself known, and the distance between then and now collapses for a moment, and the expedition feels not like history but like a memory that belongs to the land. Sacagawea belongs to that memory too. Not as a symbol. As a person. A young woman who was born in a specific valley, who fished specific rivers in her childhood, who was taken from that place by force and carried far away, who survived, who learned, who walked farther than most people in history have walked, who carried her son the whole way, who recognized her brother across the years, who stood at the edge of the Pacific and asked to see the whale. Who came from the land? Who knew the land? Who crossed the land? And who gave, freely and without compensation or formal recognition, the gift of that knowledge to a new nation that was still learning, in its first uncertain years, how to find its way? She deserves to be remembered as all of it. The whole complicated, painful, extraordinary thing. And on a quiet night like this one, when the world has gone soft and dark and still, it is easier than usual to feel the weight of a story like hers, not as a lesson to be memorized, but as a life to be honored. A life that was real. A life that mattered. A life that still shapes the world we live in, quietly, the way rivers shape the land they run through, not by force, but by the patient, consistent work of being what they are. Closing meditation. You have traveled a long way tonight. From the mountain valleys of the Lemhi Shoshone, where the light falls golden slow on the sagebrush, all the way to the gray edge of the Pacific, where the waves come in and go out regardless of who is watching. And now, slowly, gently, we return. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. Feel the surface beneath you, the mattress, the pillow, the warmth of whatever is covering you. Let the images of the journey dissolve slowly, the way mist dissolves from a river when the morning sun finds it. The high mountain passes. The wide Missouri. The cold, fast water of the clear water running toward the sea. Let them go, one by one. The stars above the northern plains, so thick and clear on a cold night that they seemed close enough to touch. The smell of wood smoke from an earthen lodge on the frozen riverbank. The low sound of a baby sleeping, close to his mother, on the long quiet river. Let the mountains settle back into the distance. Let the rivers find their own way. Sacagawea carried all of it every mile, every cold morning, every grief and recognition and small wonder in the most human way possible. Without being asked. Without being compensated. Without leaving a written record of what she saw or felt or understood. She carried it the way all of us carry the things that are most important to us, inside, quietly, moving forward. And tonight, you have carried her story for a little while. That is enough. Your breath is slow now. The world outside is quiet. Whatever thoughts were moving through your mind when you settled in tonight have grown softer, slower, further away. The continent is still out there, the mountains and the rivers and the long plains and the forests by the sea, all of it resting in the dark, in the same dark that rested over everything 200 years ago when a young woman in moccasins walked west with the whole world changing around her. She was not afraid of the dark. She had learned, very young, that the dark is simply what comes before the morning, and that the morning always, eventually, comes. Let yourself rest now. Let the story settle into sleep, the way snow settles over a mountain landscape, softly, without hurry, covering everything in quiet. You are safe. You are still. You are held by the ordinary miracle of this present moment, which is warm and close and entirely your own. Sleep well. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.